Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. So, in the next few days, AMD is finally set to release their first entry-level RDNA 2 based gaming product, the Radeon RX 6500 XT. Now, this new GPU comes with an MSRP of $200 US, though of course we expect that it will cost quite a bit more than that, beyond the limited run that you're likely to see shortly after release that will possibly hit the MSRP. In reality though, the 6500 XT is probably going to end up being priced somewhere between $300 and $400 US, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. It's also widely reported that the 6500 XT is restricted to PCI Express 4.0 x 4 bandwidth, and although AMD hasn't made that public information yet, and I am bound by NDA, this was though confirmed by ASRock, so it's not a secret at this point and has already been widely reported on. So what might this mean for the Radeon RX 6500 XT? Of course, it seems opinions are divided online. Some of you believe this will cripple the card, while others point to PCI Express bandwidth testing using flagship graphics cards, which suggests that the 6500 XT will be just fine, even in a PCI Express 3.0 system. With PCIe 4.0, you get roughly 2 GB per second of bandwidth per lane, giving the 6500 XT an almost 8 GB per second communication link between the CPU and system memory. But if you install it in a PCIe 3.0 system, that figure is halved, and this is where you could start to run into problems. However, tech media outlet TechPowerUp has shown when using an RTX 3080 that on average, performance at 1080p only drops by around 10% when limited to just 4 GB of PCIe bandwidth. And with the RTX 3080 being a significantly more powerful GPU, many have just assumed that the 6500 XT will be just fine. However, the problem with that being you're completely ignoring the fact that the RTX 3080 has 10 GB of VRAM, while the 6500 XT only has a 4 GB VRAM buffer. The smaller the memory buffer, the more likely you are to dip into system memory, and this is where the limited PCIe bandwidth will play havoc on performance. Of course, the RTX 3080 was tested using ultra quality settings, whereas the 6500 XT is much more suited to dialed down quality presets, let's say. Think medium type settings. AMD themselves though would argue that PCI Express 3.0 bandwidth won't be an issue for the 6500 XT, as gamers should ensure that they're not exceeding the memory buffer for optimal performance. But with a 4GB graphics card in modern games, and games that are yet to be released, I expect that's going to be actually really difficult. Anyway, I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. For now, I'm going to explain what we're actually doing here. Although the 6500 XT reviews will only be a few days away by the time this video goes live, I just couldn't wait after seeing the data that we'd collected. Initially, the idea was to just investigate PCIe performance with a similar spec product for my own personal reference. Bit of a heads up on what I could possibly expect when testing the 6500 XT, but as I said, the results were just so interesting that I decided to make a video. Now, to gather some insight into what this could mean for the 6500 XT, I took the 5500 XT and benchmarked several configurations. Firstly, I tested both the 4 and 8 GB versions using the stock PCI Express 4.0 x 8 configuration, and then again with PCIe 4.0 x 4. So the same configuration that we'll see with the 6500 XT, and then a final configuration using PCI Express 3.0 x 4. I've also tested a dozen games at 1080p and 1440p, and for the more modern titles, I've gone with the medium quality preset, which is a more realistic setting for this class of product, I feel. We'll go over the data for most of the games tested, and then we'll do a side-by-side comparison. For testing, I'm using our Ryzen 9 5950X test system, and of course I can change the PCI mode in the BIOS. Given the 6500 XT and 5500 XT are expected to be fairly close in terms of performance based on benchmark numbers released by AMD, using the 5500 XT to simulate potential PCIe issues of the 6500 XT should be fairly accurate. I will give the disclaimer though that the 6500 XT is based on the latest RDNA 2 architecture, and maybe this could help alleviate some of the PCIe bandwidth issues, though I have to say I'm not expecting that to be the case. But we'll keep the architectural difference in mind. Okay, let's jump into the results. Starting with F1 2021, we see that limiting the PCIe bandwidth with the 8GB 5500 XT has little to no impact on performance. Then for the 4GB model, we're seeing a 9% reduction in 1% low performance, and a 6% hit to the average frame rate when comparing the stock PCIe 4.0 x 8 configuration of the 5500 XT to PCIe 3.0 x 4. Now, that's not a massive performance hit, but it's still a reasonable drop for a product that's really not all that powerful to begin with, though I have to say it does perform quite well in F1 2021, so maybe this isn't the best example. Anyway, jumping to 1440p, we again see no real performance loss with the 8GB model, whereas the 4GB version on the other hand drops up to 12% of its original performance. Again, that isn't a significant performance loss in the grand scheme of things, and the game still was perfectly playable, but again, for a card that's not packing oodles of compute power, a double-digit performance hit will likely raise an eyebrow. Things, however, get much, much worse in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now, a couple of things to note here. Although I'm using the highest quality preset for this game, it was released back in 2018, and with sufficient PCI Express bandwidth, the 5500 XT can easily drive 60 FPS on average, resulting in an enjoyable and very playable experience. We also see that PCI Express bandwidth is far less of an issue for the 8GB model, and that's because this game does allocate up to 7GB of VRAM using these quality settings at 1080p. Having said that, the 4GB 5500 XT plays just fine using its stock PCIe 4.0x8 configuration. There were no crazy lag spikes, the game was very playable and enjoyable under these conditions. However, when limited to PCIe 4.0x4 bandwidth, we did see a 6% drop in performance, though I should comment that overall the gameplay was similar to the x8 configuration. But if we then change to the PCIe 3.0 spec, performance tanks, and while still technically playable, frame stuttering is now prevalent and the overall experience is quite horrible. We're talking about a 43% drop in 1% low performance for the 4GB model when comparing PCIe 4.0 operation to 3.0, so a shocking performance reduction there. Now, you could argue that we're exceeding the VRAM buffer, so this test isn't exactly realistic, but you'll have a hard time convincing me of that given how well the game played when using PCIe 4.0x8. And as you'd expect, jumping to 1440p certainly didn't help the situation. We're looking at a 43% hit to 1% lows once again. And again, when using PCI Express 4.0, the 4GB model was still able to deliver playable performance, while PCIe 3.0 completely cripples performance to the point where the game is simply not playable. Next, we have Resident Evil Village, and this one only required 3.4GB of VRAM in our test, so this is a good example of how these cards perform when kept within the memory buffer. Of course, I am using the heavily dialed down balanced quality preset, so for those of you targeting 60 FPS on average, these single player games will have some headroom to crank up the quality settings. Though as we've seen, you will run into performance related issues much sooner when using PCIe 3.0 with a x4 card. Speaking of which, we have a great example of just that when moving to 1440p, which in our test pushed memory allocation up to 4.8GB, with actual usage at around 4GB. PCI Express bandwidth aside, the 4GB buffer alone severely crippled the 5500 XT here, and then reducing the bandwidth further to 4 times destroys performance entirely to the point where the card can no longer be used. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege is another good example of why heavily limiting PCI Express bandwidth of cards with smaller VRAM buffers is just a bad idea. The 4GB 5500 XT is already up to 27% slower than the 8GB version, with the only difference between the two models being the VRAM capacity. But we see that limiting the PCI bandwidth has a seriously negative impact to performance for the 4GB model. Halving the bandwidth from x8 to x4 in the PCI Express 4.0 mode dropped the 1% low by 21%. This is particularly interesting as it could mean that even when used in a PCI Express 4.0 system, the upcoming 6500 XT could still be hemorrhaging performance due to the x4 bandwidth. But it gets much worse than that for those of you with PCI Express 3.0 systems, which at this point in time is really most of you, particularly those seeking a budget GPU. Here we're looking at a 52% drop in performance from the 4.0x8 configuration to 3.0x4. And worse still, 1% lows are now below 60 FPS, and while this could be solved by reducing the quality settings, the game was still perfectly playable even with 4GB of VRAM when using PCI Express 4.0x8. And as you'd expect, it's really more of the same at 1440p. We're looking at 1% lows that are slashed in half on the 4GB card when using PCI Express 3.0. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, which has been tested using the medium quality preset with medium quality textures, this game is very demanding even with these settings, But with the full PCIe 4.0 x 8 mode, the 4GB 5500 XT was able to deliver playable performance with an average of 49 FPS at 1080p. But when reducing the bus bandwidth by using PCIe 3.0 x 4, performance tanked by 24% and now the game's barely playable. And I'll wrap up the Cyberpunk 2077 testing by saying the 1440p data really isn't that relevant, as you can't really play this game with a 5500 XT at this resolution using the medium quality settings, but here's the data anyway since I have it. Watch Dogs Legion was tested using the medium quality preset, and although the 4GB model is slower than the 8GB version, as the game requires 4.5GB of memory in our test using the medium quality preset, performance was still decent when using the standard PCIe configuration with 66 FPS on average. And despite the fact that we must be dipping into system memory here, the game appeared to play just fine. However, reducing the PCIe bandwidth had a significant influence on performance, and here we see that PCIe 4.0 x 4 dropped performance by 24%, with PCIe 3.0 x 4 destroying it by a 42% margin. We've heard reports that the upcoming 6500 XT is all over the place in terms of performance, and the limited 4GB buffer along with the gimped PCIe 4.0 x 4 bandwidth is likely going to be the reason. And we can see an example of that here at 1080p with the 5500 XT. The PCIe 3.0 x 4 mode actually looks better at 1440p relative to the 4.0 spec, and this is because the PCIe bandwidth bottleneck is less severe than the compute bottleneck at this resolution. Still, we're talking about an unnecessary 36% hit to performance. Assassin's Creed Valhalla has been tested using the medium quality preset, and we do see an 11% hit to performance for the 8GB model when using PCIe 3.0 x 4. So that's interesting, as the game only required up to 4.2GB in our test at 1080p. That being the case, the 4GB model suffered much more, dropping 1% lows by 22% from 51 FPS to just 40 FPS. The game was still playable, but that's a massive performance hit on an already very low-end graphics card. The margins continued to grow at 1440p, and now the PCIe 3.0 x 4 configuration for the 4GB model was 32% slower than what we saw when using PCIe 4.0 x 8. Obviously that's a huge margin, but it's more than just numbers on a graph. The difference between these two data points was huge and very noticeable when playing the game, like we were comparing two very different tiers of product. Far Cry 6, like Watch Dogs Legion, is an interesting case study. Here we have a game that actually uses 7.2GB of VRAM in our test at 1080p, using the dialed down medium quality preset. But what's really interesting here is the fact that the 4GB and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT delivered virtually the same level of performance when fed at least x8 bandwidth in a PCIe 4.0 system, which is the default configuration for these models. So, despite heavily exceeding the VRAM buffer, or at least that's what's being reported to us, the 4GB 5500 XT makes out just fine in the PCIe 4.0 x 8 mode. However, limit it to PCIe 4.0 x 4, and the performance drops by as much as 26%. And again, remember, the 6500 XT uses PCIe 4.0 x 4. So that means right away, the upcoming 6500 XT is likely going to be heavily limited by PCIe memory bandwidth under these test conditions, even in a PCI Express 4.0 system. But of course, it gets far worse than that if you use a PCIe 3.0 system, as here we're looking at a 54% decline for the average frame rate. Or another way to put it is, the 4GB 5500 XT was 118% faster using PCIe 4.0 x 8 compared to PCIe 3.0 x 4. Yikes. Bizarrely, the 4GB 5500 XT still worked at 1440p with the full PCIe 4.0 x 8 bandwidth, but was completely broken when dropping to anything below that. I would have expected no matter how much PCIe bandwidth you fed it here, performance was still going to be horrible, but apparently not. Using the Favor Quality preset, Horizon Zero Dawn requires 6.4GB of VRAM at 1080p in our test. And interestingly, despite not exceeding the VRAM buffer of the 8GB model, we still saw an 11% decline in performance when forcing PCIe 3.0 x 4 operation. Then with the 4GB model, that margin was effectively doubled to 23%. So it's worth noting that both PCIe 4.0 configurations roughly match the performance of the 8GB model, so it was PCIe 3.0 where things once again get dicey. The 1440p results are similar though, as here we are more compute limited, but even so, reducing the PCIe bandwidth did negatively impact performance for both the 4 and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT. Doom Eternal is another interesting game to test with, as this one tries to avoid exceeding the memory buffer by limiting the level of quality settings you can use. So here I've used the ultra quality preset for both models, but for the 4GB version I've had to reduce the texture quality from ultra to medium before the game would allow me to apply the preset. So at 1080p with the ultra preset and ultra textures, the game uses up to 5.6GB of VRAM in our test scene, and that's actual usage, not allocation. Then dropping the texture pool size to medium reduced that figure to 4.1GB. So that means the 8GB 5500 XT sees VRAM usage hit 5.6GB in this test, while the 4GB model maxes out, as the game would use 4.1GB if available. And this means, despite tweaking the settings, the 4GB 5500 XT is still 29% slower than the 8GB version when using PCIe 4.0 x 8. Interestingly, reducing the PCIe bandwidth for the 8GB model still did heavily reduce performance, dropping 1% lows by as much as 16%. But of course it was the 4GB version where things went really wrong. Here the reduction in PCIe bandwidth from 4.0 x 8 to 4.0 x 4 hurt performance by 22%. Then, when switching to 3.0, well, it just destroyed performance, making the game virtually unplayable with just 35 FPS on average. The margins grew slightly at 1440p, but the results overall were much the same. If we assume that the 6500 XT is going to behave in a similar fashion to that of the 5500 XT, that means at 1440p it will end up much worse off than parts like the 8GB 5500 XT and completely crippled in PCIe 3.0 systems. Okay, so here's a breakdown of all 12 games tested, and please note I skipped over Hitman 3 and Death Stranding as the results weren't terribly interesting and I didn't want to drag this video out any longer than I had to. And of course you can see the margins here. Here we're comparing the average frame rate of the 4GB 5500 XT when using PCIe 4.0 x 8, which is the default configuration for that particular model, to PCIe 3.0 x 4. On average, we're looking at a massive 49% increase in performance for PCIe 4.0 x 8, with gains as large as 171% seen in Doom. Best case was Resident Evil Village, which saw basically no difference, but that was a one-off in our testing. Even F1 2021 saw a 6% reduction, but again, that's really a best case result. Beyond that, we're looking at double-digit gains, with well over half the games seeing margins larger than 20%. And remember, we're using the medium quality preset for most of this testing. Now, if we normalize the x-axis and switch to the 8GB model, here's how small the performance variation is when comparing PCIe 4.0 x 8 to PCIe 3.0 x 4 compared to what we saw with the 4GB model. We're still seeing some reasonably large performance gains due to the extra bandwidth, but overall the larger VRAM buffer has helped reduce the inconsistencies here, resulting in just an 8% improvement on average. Also, for those of you interested in the 1% low data, here's a quick look at that. Comparing 1% lows, see the margin for the 4GB model blow out to a 56% margin, with most games seeing at least a 30% gain. Then if we look at the 8GB model, the performance overall is significantly more consistent. Again, we're looking at on average an 8% increase for PCIe 4.0 x 8 when compared to PCIe 3.0 x 4. So that was really interesting, with a number of very telling results. For me, titles such as Watch Dogs Legion and Far Cry 6 were particularly interesting because despite exceeding the 4GB VRAM buffer, the 4GB version of the 5500 XT performed very close to that of the 8GB model when given full PCIe 4.0 x 8 bandwidth, which is the full support for those GPUs. However, limiting the 4GB model to even PCIe 4.0 x 4 heavily reduced performance, suggesting that out of the box the 6500 XT could be in many instances limited primarily by the PCI connection, which is pretty shocking. It also strongly suggests that installing the 6500 XT into a system that only supports PCI Express 3.0 could in many instances be devastating to performance. Given that, I feel all reviewers should be mindful of this and be sure to test the 6500 XT with PCIe 3.0, and really there's no excuses for not doing this. You can simply toggle between 3.0 and 4.0 in the BIOS. Of course, AMD's hoping that reviewers will overlook this, and with the majority of reviewers now testing on a PCIe 4.0 supporting system, the 6500 XT might end up looking a lot better than it's really going to for most users. And on that note, it's really well worth noting that the vast majority of gamers are limited to PCI Express 3.0. Intel, for example, only started supporting PCI Express 4.0 with their 11th generation of processors when using a 500 series motherboard, while AMD started supporting PCIe 4.0 with select Ryzen 3000 processors, but they do require an X570 or B550 motherboard. So, for example, if you had an AMD B450 motherboard, you are limited to PCIe 3.0. Furthermore, AMD's latest budget processors, such as the Ryzen 5 5600G, are limited to PCI Express 3.0, regardless of the motherboard used. Basically, anyone who has purchased a budget CPU to date, with maybe the exception of the new Alder Lake parts, will be limited to PCIe 3.0. Now, you could argue that in games such as F1 2021 and Resident Evil Village, where we did manage to keep the VRAM usage well under 4GB, that the 4GB 5500 XT was just fine, even with PCIe 3.0 x 4 bandwidth. And it's true, under those conditions, the performance hit should be little to nothing, but the problem for me is that ensuring VRAM usage remains well below 4GB in current titles, it's just going to be very difficult, and in many instances, not even possible. And even if you're in the know and you can monitor stuff like VRAM usage, unless you're aiming for 3GB or less, it's going to be really hard to know how close you are to the edge, unless of course you have an 8GB graphics card on hand for testing. And this really is the problem. The 4GB 5500 XT was always right on a knife's edge, and often slipped over it. With the full PCIe 4.0 x 8 bandwidth, it usually got away without too much of a performance hit, but with PCIe 3.0 x 4, it almost always ran into trouble, and in extreme cases wasn't even able to manage playable performance. But for me, this isn't about extreme cases where we drop to unplayable levels of performance. It's really about the fact that the card was noticeably slower when using PCIe 3.0 x 4 bandwidth. And in the case of the 5500 XT, we went from 82 FPS on average at 1080p in the 12 games tested to just 57 FPS, and that's a 30% decline in performance. But what's more crazy is the fact that when using the full PCIe 4.0 x 8 bandwidth, the 4GB 5500 XT was 26% faster than the 4GB RX 570. But when limited to PCIe 3.0 x 4, it ended up slower than the old 570 by a 12% margin. So let me just say that again. The 5500 XT was 12% slower than the RX 570, with both products using PCI Express 3.0, but the 5500 XT was limited to 4 lanes, whereas the 570 used all 16. The 6500 XT is likely to face the same problem, but as I mentioned at the start of this video, it is based on a different architecture, so maybe that'll help, we'll have to see. But if we do see no change in behavior for the 6500 XT, it's going to end up being a disaster for PCIe 3.0 users, and at best, a mixed bag using PCIe 4.0. One thing's for sure, I'll be testing all games with both PCIe 4.0 and 3.0 for my day one 6500 XT review, which hopefully you'll be able to see in a few days if I get a card in time. And of course, I will be using the same visual quality settings that were shown in this video. And that's going to do it for this one. If you enjoyed this little PCI Express investigation, then please do hit the like button and be sure that you're subscribed, because you're not going to want to miss our day one 6500 XT review, which, as I said, is hopefully coming up in a few days' time. Also, if you'd like more Hardware Unboxed goodness, then you can follow us, or basically support us, on Patreon or Floatplane, where I guess in a way we help support you. We have a Discord chat where we can help you out or answer your questions or just talk to you in general. Tim and I do a live stream where we do all that sort of stuff live. We also have behind the scenes content to give you guys a bit more insight into what goes on behind the scenes, and a Q&A series. So yeah, Floatplane or Patreon if you're interested in that stuff. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.